let's see if I can go without this mic. Hi, can the people at the back hear me? No? Okay, I'll use the mic then. All right, so hi everyone. My name's Hong, and I head up the Open Government Products team at Gtech. We're part of the Data Science and Artificial Intelligence division. And as Xavier mentioned, what we are is we are a team which proactively tries to identify things that the government should be doing in regards to technology, and we prototype those solutions and we try to go advocate and get people to implement them. So today I'm going to be sharing with you, well, it's sort of like split between two slide decks, so hopefully you'll bear with me in the transition. But I'm going to take with you a deep dive into sort of like the story about how we built one of our apps and sort of like the entire product development cycle, starting from sort of original idea to sort of initial prototypes and testing and all that. And I'm also going to be sharing with you some of our sort of newer initiatives that we're working on since we've launched this and how we go about that as well. Cool, so just really quickly, just show of hands. How many of you here have some kind of like computer science background? Anyone? Oh, wow, okay, so like maybe like 40% of you, maybe 30 to 40% of you. How many of you have like worked in like product development before at like a tech company? All right, good, so a handful of you guys. Sorry, well, all right, so for those of you who have done like tech development before, hopefully this isn't too boring. It's a fairly straightforward way about how you do product development. For those of you who have worked at like bigger companies or the government, this is fairly like, this is, I think, different enough from how things are normally done in big corporate environments that I think is worth talking about. So yeah, at any point if there's anything, just let me know. So this is the problem that we're trying to solve. How many of you here drive in Singapore? Okay, well, basically none. So if any of you guys drive in Singapore, this was the solution that we had in the 21st century for how you pay for parking on the street. Basically, you go buy these booklets of coupons from 7-Eleven. You go poke holes in them to mark what time you're using them, and you lay them out on your dashboard on your car. And then a parking warden comes by, and she like peers through your windscreen, and she looks at it, and she basically like counts to see whether the money you've paid together with the times you've marked on the coupons like combine to a sort of valid payment of your parking session. And as you can imagine, this gets fairly complicated fairly quickly. This is not a stock photo, by the way. This is something that I was like trying to pitch the project, and I was walking by a car park, and I saw this, and I was like, this is perfect. This illustrates the problem. And the key thing about this, I think to note, is that like there's a whole bunch of frustration around dealing with paper. Obviously, like it's annoying. You have to go to 7-Eleven, you have to buy them, you have to poke holes out of them, and you got like little bits of trash everywhere in your car. But the biggest frustration with this is that it creates this really weird tension point where, like, let's say you're in a meeting, right? And the meeting runs long, and you only plan parking, and you only paid up for an hour. So you're sitting there in a meeting, and while you're trying to have this like sane conversation with someone, you're looking at the clock, and the clock is ticking down. And as it ticks down to your parking session, you're just sitting there trying to like smile and keep conversation, while at the back of your head, you're like, God, I'm going to get fined. I'm going to get fined. It's horrible. It creates this extremely high tension situation with these like little pieces of paper, just because of the mechanism that has been put in place. And this is our solution. It's pretty straightforward. It's an app that does three things. One, it calculates how much you need to pay automatically, and you can pay using your credit card and all that. And more importantly, if you're running out of time, you can extend your parking session with your phone. And finally, if you put too much time initially, you can get a refund. If you end early, you just get a refund for the remaining cash. And it's not a lot, like parking in Singapore is like 60 cents to 120 an hour. So realistically, you get a couple cents back. But still, it feels good, right, to not have to get a few cents back for something that you didn't use. And that's it. And I think that's one of the key points about all this in terms of this product development, which is that we focused on very, very few things. Like you're trying to innovate, you're trying to push, you're trying to make things new and interesting and trying to make things better. But in order to do so, you need to focus on your very clear value proposition. Because if I were to say, we want to build an app for people to park their cars, there's literally this laundry list of features, like a very long list of things that you could possibly do. You could like help people find car parks, you could help people pay their parking fines, you could help identify their vehicle numbers and all this sort of thing. But we focused on really just the core thing that we wanted to fix, which was making this problem go away. And from there we developed. So this is sort of the evolution of the app, just to sort of give you a sense of how these things go. Right here on the left is the earliest concept we ever did for the app. This was done in like 2013 or something like that. And on the right is what we finally launched with at the end of 2017, I believe. October 2017, I think, yes. And you can see how the app, sort of the UI and everything evolved along the way. Now, this literally was done in PowerPoint. It just drag drop in squares and like text boxes and all that. This was done with a nicer like UI toolkit, and then we actually had what we tested with, and then we got it all cleaned up for launch. And this is the sort of timeline I'm going to be walking through. So the prototype, meaning I think this one, the second one was in end of 2016, and then the development of the app went over a course of a year. And I'm going to be walking through this timeline and taking some deep dives into some of the design decisions we made along the way. Again, if there's anything you have questions about, please feel free to interrupt. I'm more than happy to answer things. So yeah, we start phase one with the prototype of how we develop the app. So this here is the first ever concept slide. Basically, this was part of a sort of brainstorming session. I sat down for basically a few days and just churned out I think 24 slides of possible ideas of things the government could do. And there's a whole lot. Each slide was really just 3 panels up like this, like a comic book. Like a comic, you just, core idea, right? A driver submits the payment through the app. You have some kind of app for the enforcement officer to check to make sure the guy's paid up correctly. And finally, you have your back-end systems, which give you access to the artificial intelligence, your information, your data science, all that good stuff that you still want to do. So this we've built. This turns out to be completely useless, and I'll explain why later. And this we are still in the midst of working on. So even in this first initial concept slide, we've gotten to about here. So just sort of to illustrate that you don't need like a really, really thorough and complicated sort of strategy deck of like where are you going to go. What you need to do is identify what your core value is, and even for this simple thing, it's going to take you quite a while to deliver all of it. And this is the first working prototype of the app that we ever built. So compared to like this, which I was showing you earlier, this looks nothing like this. And for those of you who are fairly astute, you'll see that this isn't even an app at all. This is just a database that we manually added entries into. When we first started building this, the whole point, what our focus was mostly on the enforcement side of things, of how you could use computer vision and use to recognize the license plate number, and if the license plate number was correct, you didn't have to peer through the windscreen and do all that good stuff. And so literally we just had a database that you typed your license plate number into, and you would take a picture, and there you demonstrate that you could digitally park, and that was it. And take note, this is obviously not very usable. But the key point is that at this early stage, when you're trying to do product development on this, you're not worried about polish or maintainability or analytics or any of that long-term sort of broader stuff. What you're trying to do initially when you're trying to pitch a new idea and trying to get people to adopt something is you're trying to bridge the gap between your imagination and theirs. Because by definition, when you're doing something new and innovative, you're doing something no one else has thought of before. Well, hopefully no one else has thought of before, or it hasn't been thought of that much. Which means that the person you're talking to, whether it is your boss, your investor, or your teammates or something like that, will have thought about it a lot less than you have. And it's not because they're dumb, it's just that this is your idea. And so your goal initially is not to build your sort of magnum opus. Your goal is to have them be able to point to that thing and say, hey, that thing that you showed me, I don't have the words to describe it because I haven't thought about it as much as you have, but I want that thing. I think that's a good idea. You will never get to a stage where someone is able to describe your idea as well as you can because it's your idea. But you can get to a stage where they sort of recognize that point of what is possible, and then you can move forward. And so that's what we did. We had a visit from one of the ministers one day to our office, and we weren't even on the schedule. We put together our little prototype like this, and in between his meetings, going between meeting rooms, we just caught him for a moment and showed him on our laptops, hey, take a look at this app. And he's like, oh, that's pretty interesting. I want that. You should go talk to people about getting this built. And that was it. That was how the project sort of got off the ground. And that sort of leads us to sort of how we develop things, at least on my team. We prototype before pitching. Because in the government especially, there are a lot of slide decks floating around about this is going to be the next big thing that changes governance or is the future of the society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you make another slide deck that promises to change the world, it doesn't really mean anything, actually. But within the government, prototypes, people who can develop things, people who can make things happen, some initial thing that someone can touch with their fingers is actually pretty rare. And so it's much easier to argue that something is possible when you have some working version of it, even if in a really initial state that people can interact with and sort of get a sense that this is not just talk. Which brings us to phase 2 of our project, the proposal. of how we describe this, of how we're going to actually get this thing off the ground, right? So this prototype is clearly not usable. It's not a plan. It's not a strategy. It's just a thing that you can show people. So now we need to figure out, all right, what's our execution plan? How are we going to develop this? How are we going to figure things out? How are we going to go through the iteration cycles? And the goal of this stage is quite explicitly to test something with actual users. Because until you validated something with an actual user, you don't have a product idea. You just have some hypothesis in your head that this maybe is something that might be interesting. And so your immediate goal is to get something in the hands of the people who you think you are going to be helping and see whether or not they actually think this is useful. Again, you're still not worried about all this long-term stuff. Immediate goal, just test something with actual users. And so even to get to this stage, even to test something with a real user, there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to figure out. It's non-trivial, right? You need to actually have some kind of app that people can poke their finger at. Like manually editing a database, while it's okay for you because it's your system, is not going to be able to communicate anything to a layman about your idea. And on top of that, on the bureaucratic side, there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to figure out as well. You need to figure out how to get feedback. You need to figure out how you're going to pay for the various things that you're going to use to test. And so you need to sort all this out. But most importantly, the first thing you need to do is talk to people. So our core idea, remember, as I told you earlier, was that you would use computer vision to take pictures of license plates and then identify the text in those license plates and then check to see if they are valid automatically. And this lady, she'd been doing this for I think 30 years, if I remember correctly. And so that mess I showed you earlier, where was that? This mess I showed you earlier, how long would it take you to figure this out, whether or not the guy had parked up? Probably take you at least a couple minutes, right? She takes 2 seconds. So she would literally walk up to the car, and she'd just peer through, and then, yep, that's good, and then she'd move on. And so our entire premise of the app, meaning that we would save that time, was just useless because she'd been doing this for so long that ignoring the accuracy of computer vision, ignoring your server latency and reliability and all that sort of thing, just having to take your phone out of your pocket and squat in front of a car to take a picture of the license plate was already slower than the enforcement. And we only figured this out after just walking with her on the ground and seeing how they did things. And so, project dead, right? Core idea bumped. Well, turns out we had a much simpler solution. Instead of using computer vision, we used the high technology known as a guest list. This was it. So instead of using optical character recognition to identify all these things, our new solution was just, you'd have a list of the cars which are allowed to be in that car park. And so as you walk down, instead of taking pictures of every single license plate, you just look at the license plate and you just to see if that license plate is on the list. And if it is, then everything's good. If it's not on the list or it's expired recently, like the red ones, then it's bad. And that's it. So the point here is that it's not about, a lot of this digital innovation is not about using high technology. It's about solving solutions in the most efficient manner possible, and new technology opens up new solutions, but you should still try as far as possible to keep, you should try to use as dumb a solution as you can in order to solve the problem very elegantly, if that makes sense. So despite all this, despite all the development we did, all the talking to users and the figuring out of the enforcement app, our real breakthrough in the project was nothing to do with us. It was when the government decided to raise the price of parking from 50 cents every half hour to 60 cents every half hour. And of course, when you use this with physical coupons, like paper coupons, a whole bunch of things happen, right? Firstly, people have to go rush out to buy the new coupons, which they ran out of stock of, and a lot of people were very mad because now you couldn't park and not get a parking fine without the new coupon. And then people had to trade in their old coupons for credit, and there were crowds and lines at the various offices for people trading in their coupons, and that was annoying. And so out of the midst of all this, I remember we were supposed to have a meeting with the agency on that Thursday to sort of talk to them about the idea. On that Monday morning, our boss gave us a call and was like, hey, are you guys free this afternoon for an urgent meeting? And we was like, weird, we're going to meet you on Thursday, sure. And we went to them, so we went to meet with them that afternoon. And apparently what had happened was one of the ministers spoke to a cab driver, and the cab driver told the minister, why don't you just have an app? And the minister went to the ministry and was like, why don't we have an app? And the ministry went to the agency and was like, why do we have an app? And so they said, yes, that was a brilliant idea. And so they came to us. And that idea you've been talking to us about for the last, I think at this point, was 4 or 5 months? How quickly can you do it? And so just overnight, just because there was a sudden rush of public support behind an idea, because there was a pain point, something that we've been trying to pitch for a long time became like much easier to sail through. And so we said 3 months. And so they said, okay. And so we started development proper. Which brings us to alpha testing. So alpha testing is, so when you're doing any sort of new development, it's important to distinguish between the two various phases of what you're trying to do. There's a stage where you're trying to explore and find new ideas, and then there's a stage where you're trying to converge and actually like nail down what you actually want to agree upon. And alpha testing is about that. Alpha testing is about exploration and validation. It's about figuring out all the things you don't know. Because most product ideas are bad. It's not anyone's fault. It's just that the space of possible ideas is so large that if you were to pick an arbitrary idea, even a very smart person were to pick an arbitrary idea, the chances are that that's a good idea is extremely low. Realistically, and so even companies like Apple, right, who are sort of this paragon of sort of like visionary design, for every product they launch, there are dozens of prototypes that you don't see that they throw away. Because development in an innovative space, in a space that no one's been in before, is not about planning really well, because there's nothing to plan, it's new. It's about picking a good first approximation and then doing the legwork to converge towards the good solution. And that's why you need a very explicit exploration phase when you're developing a new project in a new area. And so for us, we started really small. We started in one car park, just one car park and 10 staff, 10 government workers. So we didn't launch with a public pilot. We didn't go to 1,000 people. 10 of us just in the meeting, we're like, okay, who drives and who wants to volunteer to try this out? And we started one car park and one enforcement officer. And this is what we had to figure out. So even for testing this basic, we put together our first sort of actual user app, working user app of how this would work. As you can see, it used stock components, so it had no, we didn't have any custom UI or fancy animations, really just bare bones, no frills. The idea here is just to get people using this and see, does this work? And even with just this simple test, we figured out a bunch of things. So for example, how you would calculate your parking duration, of how to pay for parking on a car. So this is the first of a couple of deep dives I'm going to take into the various engineering decisions, engineering and product and UX design decisions we made along the way. So at the top right here, this is what it looks like if you use a coupon to pay for parking on the street. You mark out how long you're going to park for, and you use coupons, and if you end before the specific end of the coupon time, there's a whole bunch of time that you paid for that you just didn't use. And it sucks. That's just the way things were, because you had this physical medium that you had to deal with. And so one of the questions we commonly get, and the first instinct from a lot of people when you're having these apps, when you have an app to pay for parking, is why don't you just start and stop your payment? Like you just start when you want to start parking, you just press start on your phone, and when you're done, you press stop, and then you just get charged for the period of time that you were there. Now that works fine, generally speaking, but if you for some reason don't end your parking session, or you forget, you now owe infinite money, and that's pretty bad. And realistically, you don't actually owe infinite money, right? Realistically, you put a you cap it at like $30 or something like that, and then you put a warning in there saying, hey, warning, please, this is what will happen if you don't end your parking session properly. We'll charge you $30. But still, people won't read that warning, and then they'll forget, and then they'll appeal to you. And the first time you have to keep track of them. Oh, this guy's the first time appeal, so we'll forgive them. But if the guy's appealing every single time, then maybe you can't forgive. It just gets really, really complicated. I made the parking app, and I still forget to end my parking session half the time. So you can just imagine the amount of trouble this will cause if you don't get this resolved. And so we came up with this solution, which was we follow the basic parking coupon system of pre-declaring how long you want to park for. But at the end, when you finish, you just say, I want to end early, and then we refund you for this block of time. So effectively, you still get the same thing of charging people per minute and not wasting any of their money. But very importantly, without ever having to explain a single sentence anywhere in the app about how this works, people will understand what happens if they forget to end their parking session. Well, if you forget to end your parking session, you just pay the full amount that you originally said. And we never have to explain this to anyone. It's known. It feels fair, right? And occasionally, yes, once every couple of weeks, we have someone who, despite this, will appeal and still ask for a refund and all that. And sure, you can handle that. But it's very important that people feel the way your app deals with them, the way your business deals with them, it feels fair. It feels like it's intuitive, there's no gotcha, there's no trick. You can sort of move forward. This is another example of that, of how we do price calculation. So this is a bit of more of a deep dive. But basically, turns out calculating prices is non-trivial for parking because there's a lot of different schemes and stuff you have to mix and match to figure out. It's not just how much it is per minute, but if you park for the whole day, there's a discount. If you park for the whole night, there's a discount. There are blocks in the middle of the day where you're not allowed to park, et cetera, et cetera. And so skipping past the specific technical details, but basically we use a search algorithm to identify what the lowest cost scheme is for someone to park their car. And this seems like a trivial thing, right? Like, it's just a couple of cents, let people choose their own parking prices. But the philosophy behind this, behind helping people price calculate the lowest price possible, as well as helping people like intuitively choose how much they want to pay, how long they want to park for, is about making sure that you help the user make good decisions. Because it would have been very easy, I think, in this case, to go for the default and just say, it's your fault. You see, you didn't end your parking session. You made a mistake, and it's your fault, and therefore you owe the money. And it's equally easy to say that, hey, it's your fault. You didn't realize that there was a discount for the bulk purchase of time, and so it's your fault. You paid more money. But if you think about it, that doesn't really help anyone, right? As the app developer, I don't make any more money off of it. As the user feels bad, and you just spend time arguing back and forth, and that basically just destroys any tiny marginal amount of money you could have gotten. And as someone who's developing a new system, you realize you have a lot of control around around the kinds of decisions that people make using your system. And so when you're trying to develop these things, it's important to remember that yes, you can't save everyone. There will always be people who do funny things with the things that you've developed and made. But you should, as far as possible, try to help them make good decisions. So at the end of the alpha test, there's a whole bunch of stuff we figured out. We figured out how we did the price calculation, we figured out the block refund system, but most importantly, we had this. We had positive reception, and this was the key thing because after months and months of development and validation, you took what was basically just a product hypothesis, an idea that maybe this is useful, and you now have actual confirmation that this is something that people will be happy to have if you built. And then now you can sort of stream forward and start building the actual thing you want. Which brings us to beta testing. So beta testing is about focus and stability, right? Instead of alpha testing, which is about divergence, beta testing is about convergence. It's about narrowing down and figuring out what the actual thing you want to build is. Because when you figure out this whole large area, there's a whole bunch of possible things you can build, but basic cost benefit analysis chart, you need to figure out what the things that you really want that are really worthwhile doing are, and all the things that still have some value, but are just not worth the complexity to build. So if you were to take a look at this, one of the ways we do this is you have a priority list. And this is sort of one of the, I wouldn't say an innovation, but one of the key ways you can sort of help something when you're doing something you slide through a bit more easily. Because traditionally, when you're doing product development, there's a phase called gather requirements, right? You're the project manager, you're put in charge of a project, and you go around gathering requirements. You go to all the various different departments, and you ask each and every single stakeholder what they want, what they're hoping to get out of the project. And they'll tell you, and you end up with this giant list. And in our case, it was 176 features long. And you take that list, and you go to the developer, and you go, here, build this. And unsurprisingly, when you do that, you end up with a big bloated app that does a lot of things very poorly. And that doesn't help anyone. So one of the things that you do is you just prioritize all the things that are important on the list. Now this seems trivial, but it has a few very interesting effects, right? The first one is that it helps you make the trade-offs very explicitly upfront about what you are or not going to do. When you're in a meeting and you're trying to have people, let's say they want to have multiple payment schemes, and this was something people push very well. Multiple modes of payment, very important. We want people to pay with credit cards, be able to pay with bank transfers, pay with Pay Now and a bunch of other e-payment systems. You're like, okay, sure, you might think that's important, but is it more important than per minute charging? Is it more important than being able to access your parking history? Probably not, right? And these are trade-offs that you actually have to end up making anyway, but normally if you don't actively prioritize upfront, you end up making these trade-offs, realizing these trade-offs way later in the development cycle, and you realize that you've taken on too many things and your project's now over time and over budget. And so that, actively filtering and prioritizing is a very critical thing, even if you're trying to do something new. Projects really die because they get too small. They die because they get too big. there's never been a case, at least in my personal experience, of someone doing a small thing really well and being unable to scale that. But there are plenty and plenty of cases of these giant, big government projects which like are supposed to change everything about how we do everything, and they just end up spending a lot of money and not doing very much. So try to focus on keeping things small. So as an example of this, we have no logins. So yes, login systems could be one of these things. Everyone has to log into everything. Now when you have a weather app on your phone, it asks you to log in with Facebook so you can get your information. But it turns out the moment you have logins, everything becomes way more complex, right? You have password resets, you have security policy, you have all these sort of things. By getting rid of all that, there's a whole bunch of work that now you don't have to do. And actually, I think that's one of the key things. A lot of design is not about adding new systems. It's about realizing all the things that you're doing that are actually unnecessary and that you can take away. I will skip past this. This is sort of like a more deep dive into our data model and design. You can come talk to me about this later. But basically, the idea is that you want to make sure that there's a lot of consistency in how you develop these things, where you never have a case where someone's made a payment, but their parking session doesn't go through, and vice versa. That you've never, because put it this way, we have about, I think, 6 million parking sessions after a year so far. And growing, for the first year after launch. If something fails, if the payment taking fails 0.1% of the time, that's still 6,000 like public user reports, like customer service issues that you have to deal with. And our team is about 3 people. So 3 people, if we spend our time, if even we have a mistake, this happens 0.1% of the time, basically we'll be swamped with dealing with this and we won't be able to make any progress. So yeah. So finally, a lot of this is about testing. And so the key point about testing when you're testing these new things is that testers are a scarce resource. Most people, just by human nature, only give feedback once. There are some people who give me feedback multiple times, but most people only give feedback once. And because most people only give feedback once, if you release your new idea to everyone, they will all tell you it sucks in the exact same way. Because it's your first idea. It's going to have a very obvious problem. So the way you iterate on this and the way you use is you use the people who are willing to test and iterate with you as a scarce resource, where you show the first few people, you get the obvious feedback in, and then you show the next few people, and you get the less obvious feedback in. And only after you've gotten like all the obvious problems solved, then do you go to more general, like wider audiences to get the more and more esoteric problems that you can refine your idea. Yeah, so at the end of beta testing, we had a whole bunch of stuff we didn't manage to implement, but is a very important note, not launch blocking. There'll be a whole bunch of stuff we didn't manage to get to. We didn't have support for motorcycles initially, which seemed weird because a lot of people ride motorcycles. But that was okay because it wasn't a launch blocking issue. We can still provide value to people who drive cars even if we don't cover motorcycles. Which finally brings us to our sort of production launch. So after going through all these development cycles, there's a lot about polish and contingency. Like you want to make sure everything goes smoothly, right? Because even after all the testing you've done, you will run into a lot of issues in terms of like bugs that you did not catch despite all your testing and all your validation. And so, for example, we refined the UI a lot, right? We tested all, and after all our testing and throughout beta, when we finally launched, our user interface was cleaned up quite a lot. The core elements are still the same, but just sort of on what you emphasize and what you see becomes a lot more streamlined. The key thing to think about when you're sort of going to this, I know this is very specific to app development, is that if you think about like Google or Amazon or Facebook or Twitter, right? These sort of like tech titans of industry, and you think about how much time you spend on them on your phone. You spend maybe like a couple minutes a day using Google or Amazon. And that's Amazon and Google. For your little thing that you've made, you're going to be an even tinier part of people's lives, which means that you have at most like 30 seconds from all your months of development, from someone opening your app to actually understanding what it does. And that's a key, and once you've realized that you have only that little small point to communicate with them, you need to really compress all the complexity that you spent in developing into as simple a package as possible. And it's non-trivial to do, but if you look at what we finally arrived at, there are maybe like 5 or 6 different elements that vary across the app. Yeah, and that's what we try to get to. So this is an example of a bug of no matter how much you test, you will run into problems. You can see that this is the same car parked in the same place, running 2 concurrent parking sessions at the same time. So this is a double charging bug, is referred to as And basically, this was a result of, even with our basic testing, sorry, I will skip past the boring details, you get to a nice, there was a weird use case we had where even with someone trying to park, it would get to the server, it would get to the database on the server, but the reply would go undelivered. And normally we would detect this. We would detect that there's a double parking session, it's an exact duplicate. But in this particular case right here, you can see that one started at 7:31 and one started at 7:32. The reason why this happened was because there was an odd use case that someone tried to park, it failed, but the minute ticked over. And because the minute ticked over, this now managed to slip past our duplicate detection system, and now there's a double charge that occurred. So these are examples of sort of the more increasingly rare and esoteric bugs that you will encounter when you actually start going to more and more people. So yeah, this is sort of I can talk about this more in person if you're interested, but this is sort of an example of how we designed the idempotency protocol. So yeah, this whole parking app was built with about 3 people. And so this is a lot smaller than most government apps. A lot of government projects are done with like teams of like 10 to like 50 people and spend like tens of millions of dollars. Our app right now is being used by about 70% of all drivers in Singapore, so quite a large proportion of the population. But it doesn't need to be very big. Again, it's much easier to innovate with a lot of small focused teams and grow them later rather than start with a big honking project. So I'm gonna leave a bit of time for Q&A, but just very quickly before I get that, I'm going to show you a couple of the other projects that we're working on. Yeah. So this is everything about parking like we talked about. This is one of our new initiatives, Form.sg. Sorry, this is a bit of a transition. So you know how the government has a lot of paper forms, and everywhere else in the world, you're trying to go paperless, you're trying to get rid, you're trying to digitize, but the government has a lot of paper forms. In fact, by our estimates, the Singapore government has about 60,000 paper forms still existing. If you count like PDFs and stuff, you have to print out, sign, and then scan them and email them back to someone. And the reason for this is quite simple. There are about 6,000 to 60,000 forms, depending on estimates, and they cost between $20,000 to $200,000 each to digitize, looking at the sort of like costs and the bids from the various vendors, which means that the cost to digitize the government is between $120 million to $12 billion to go paperless. This is a lot of money, and so it's unsurprising that you still have so much paper in government. So our solution is quite straightforward. We built Google Forms for the government. You know how if you're friends who have weddings or events or parties or whatever, you just send out an RSVP with Google Forms, and it takes you less than 5 minutes to put together. And the reason why the government can't do that is because there's security concerns, there's hosting concerns, there's policy things. And so we built a version of Google Forms that was essentially compliant with a lot of the government regulations. The key insight that we had was that instead of storing all your responses on the server as this big juicy target that everyone has all this information that now can be hacked and will leak everyone's, for example, employment information or healthcare information, every time someone submits a form, instead of being sent to a server where it's stored, it's just sent as an email through to the government worker's email inbox. And so instead of one big database, all the form responses are now distributed across all the government workers and all the various email inboxes that they store. It's not ideal, don't get me wrong. Ideally, you want to integrate into a live working database and like a CRM system, et cetera, et cetera. But this at least gets the first step of digitization off the ground. So I'm going to skip past a lot of the technical details in the architecture and so forth. But the key thing I want to say is that this launched about a year ago. And the first form that we launched with this was for pigeon complaints. Because when you build this new system, I wish it was the case that you went with this new system, you're like, hey, it solves all your problems. It solves a $12 billion problem, right? Why do you use it? And no, that's not going to happen. Because you go to the industries, they're like, this is a new thing, I'm not sure, I'm a bit apprehensive. And so the first person we managed to convince to try this out was I think the AVA, the veterinary authority, because there were a lot of pigeons in some areas and they were causing noise and crapping all over the place, etc. And they had a paper form for people to complain about them. And so we digitized that, and that was our first form. And after we digitized that, we moved on to handling feedback forms for school fun fairs. You know how when you have your school carnivals, etc., you want to see how much fun people are having. You have a little school fun fair, and you run that. And from there, we went to the Ministry of, from there, the school started using it. And from there, once the school started using it, it was easy to get the Ministry of Education on board, and so on and so forth. We now have 1,700 forms digitized, which is a lot less than where we want to get to. But yeah, you start really small. You start with a really small, whatever you can get your hands onto, and you sort of scale up from there. At least that's our experience. And so you can see that for the first couple months, we didn't have much traction, but over like small, consistent efforts of taking our wins where we could, we've now managed to get quite a lot of form responses going through this digital service. Our goal is to try and get the Singapore government to digitize and have no more paper forms by the end of this year. So hopefully, and we seem to be on good track to get there. So yeah, so just finally, before I open the questions, this is one of our new sort of exploratory projects. It's called OpenDoc. Basically, the idea is that there's all this public documentation, that these are documents of public record, but realistically, when you try to find them, they're like, you have to go make a request to some department somewhere, and you have to print it out, or it's hidden in a PDF on some corner of some website, which you have to log into before you can access. And so OpenDoc is quite straightforward. Basically, it's a standard template for all government websites, all government information to be published. Do you guys all know what GitHub is? Just really quickly, yes? Okay, so for those of you who don't know what GitHub is basically the one website where all open source software lives nowadays. Not quite exactly, but more or less. And so we're taking that, and the idea is that if you can take open source software and you can use those same principles to open source all of government information and public documents that can now be easily accessed by everyone, you sort of encourage the free flow of information throughout your society. And that's one of the newer projects that we're working on right now. So yeah, with that, I think I will leave it. I'll leave it there. So these are some of the three main projects. Parking is one of the most established ones, we launched about a year ago. Forms is sort of in the process of launching, and OpenDoc is one of the new things that we're working on. And hopefully that gives you some insight into sort of how we do product development, how we identify ideas, and how we iterate and move forward. Thank you. Yeah.
Project and to go back and forth in different iterative process that we use in design thinking methods, which is very interesting. But we have a few minutes for quick Q&A. Yeah, just
Yep. Yes.
So basically you're going to span every government worker with over 50.
That is correct. So don't get me wrong, this is non-ideal. So right now, you're absolutely correct. This is non-ideal, but the fact is that right now, this is happening with paper forms exist currently. So you submit a paper form, and that has to go through whatever internal mail system till it arrives at someone's desk, and he has a big pile of forms on his desk, and he sits there for days looking at the paper form and typing in stuff into the system. As opposed to 100 paper forms, yes. Not every form goes to every government worker. It goes to the person who created the form. So one of the things we're working on right now. So this is our current iteration to get it off the ground. One of the new features that we're working on is so that you don't have to receive an email. And what we do is instead we just send you an encryption key. The forms, when someone submits a form, they get encrypted and get stored on a server in encrypted form, but the server doesn't have the decryption key. The encryption key is sent separately as an email to the person who's supposed to receive the forms, and so they don't have to get an email inbox spammed. What they do is they just take that encryption key and go to our server, download the forms, and then decrypt it when they need it, which allows us to still have, which allows you to avoid the email problem, but still avoid, and store on a server, store the information on a server, but still avoid a giant blob of, a giant potential hacking target with one single key to crack. So yes, you're right. So the picture is not so much that this is supposed to be the end-all solution for all your digitization efforts. The picture is supposed to be, this is the first cut. This is getting the customer-facing side of things digitized and online and paperless, so that and if you want to digitize your internal processes later more slowly, that's okay, but you don't make the citizens suffer because of your internal sort of frictions. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Hi, yes.
So you mentioned that 70% of drivers are using Parking.sg. What prevents the rest of them from adopting to this new technology, which is obviously much better than
Yes. So he asked, 70% of drivers are using Parking.sg. What stops the rest of them from using it? Yeah, so pretty straightforward. So we looked into it. We literally went to a car park and stood there and like watched as people used various things, and we found the people who use Parking coupons and went to talk to them. Turns out a lot of it is, first, the big part of it is just sort of fear of technology. It's surprising, yes. We initially thought this was a marketing problem that people didn't realize or didn't understand or didn't hear. And there are some people who have never heard of it, but I think a year after launch, most people in Singapore have heard of it. The holdouts tend to be sort of the older generation who, even when you tell them what it does and shows a clear advantage, there is a general aversion to using an app to do things as opposed to a physical medium. It's unclear why. I mean, maybe it's just a general fear, but like you try to explain to them that you get a refund, you get money back, you show them, you walk them through it, but they just don't want to have anything to do with it. And that's okay, you're not going to be able to force them, but that's a big part of it. Another big part of it is language support. So most people in Singapore speak some form of English, some sort of English, but for some of the older generations, which, you know, their English isn't as good. And so one of the things we're working right now is supporting, you know, Chinese, Tamil, Malay, you know, the various other languages to get these remaining cohorts. Yes. Cool. Other questions? Anyone?
Could you elaborate a bit about the wishes of Singapore to become digital country, digital city?
Yes. Yeah, so basically, the way our team approaches this and the sort of general philosophy behind what we do is that if you were to really if you were to sort of like take a moment to sort of imagine what does a city of the future look like really just as a pure sort of like creative exercise, right? What does a city of the future look like? And you have to write, you know, you have to imagine like flying cars and all these sort of things. But you actually have to start writing down like as line items, like the things you would need to achieve in order to be a sort of digitized society. I think you very quickly realize that it's not actually that many things. It's about 24 things or so. And you will get a lot of basic things like, for example, you want to be able to access any like public information very easily, right? There should be one is there's no forms. You should have free access to information. When you go to the hospital, they should be able to use artificial intelligence to help your doctor diagnose you, and so that you don't ever miss any of these things, misdiagnose things as often as you do. When the police try to catch someone, catch a criminal, yes, you have both like sort of the privacy of not spying on citizens in general, but if you need to investigate someone, you have access to all this information when people are willing to share it, and so instead of being, you know, relying on eyewitness accounts and like scraps of paper being shuffled around the police's. And for transportation, you would want a few things like you would plan your buses in sort of optimized fashion. You have like self-driving buses going around in optimized routes that are dynamically planned to account for traffic and all these sort of things so that people can get back and forth very quickly. And the thing that we have right now is that we are currently in a stage where our ability to build things has basically caught up with our ability to imagine them. And I think that's the key difference between sort of the current age and maybe like 30 years ago. If you look at sci-fi and if you look at sci-fi in the 70s or 80s, it's very much about these fantastic future magical things, right, that you could possibly do. But if you look at sci-fi now, it's not about fantastic new technologies. It's about current technologies being taken to their sort of logical conclusions. And so that's why, and that's our sort of our approach to sort of digitizing the country, which is there are a lot of these things which are already being done in far more trivial environments. So if you were to look at Amazon, for example, or Facebook, if you're trying to figure out like how big the like button should be, or like the buy it now button, what color it should be and its placement on the page, that has been tested to death. Like you have entire teams of data scientists and like UX researchers and software engineers figuring out every last detail to make that as fast and as easy as possible. And if you're trying to play like, you know, Candy Crush, for example, and they're trying to figure out like what the reward should be or how complex the level should be, you have entire teams figuring these sophisticated things out. And yet when it comes to the public sector, like healthcare or transportation, there's a distinct lack of this technological sort of sophistication. And our approach is basically, if we could take a fraction of this stuff that we're already doing in the private sector, take a fraction of these things that are being used to sell people more coffee or buy more like crystals in their games, or like get people or to successfully target your marketing campaign for your luxury brand, and use that for public good purposes, you can achieve like pretty much like future societies with current technologies. And it doesn't require you to do crazy, crazy cutting edge research. It just requires you to take what's already well established and well practiced in the industry and applying it to important public sector problems. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? If not, yes.
What is the conscious decision to limit your team to just 3 people?
Oh, okay. So my team as a whole is about 25 people right now. 3 people are for one particular project. Yes, it is but on that note, it is a very conscious decision. So the reason, the hypothesis we have is that you try to keep your team focused and do small things well. Generally speaking, if you have more people, obviously you can do more things. I could flesh it out. That list you saw of a whole bunch of features, we could have done more of that list. But I think in working in a space like the public sector, where there's so much that isn't being done, it is probably more valuable to take people and work on solve a lot of problems to their first approximation than to like really, really make the best parking app ever. Because if you're thinking about it, parking is such a small, trivial problem, right? It's a first world problem. It's for people who have cars and the minor frustration they face when they have to park those cars, which is not like fundamentally going to change society. But by having that done, you can demonstrate to people that this really common frustration doesn't have to exist. And that gives you the credibility to go work on other things. And so our approach is each team, I think most of our project teams, our team as a whole is 25, most project teams are between 2 to 4 people max. So that you stay very focused. And it does feel bad when you're working on a team because there's so many things you want to do, but we have so limited and we have to focus. But I think being focused really does help. So yes, it is a conscious decision to a large degree. Yeah. Any other questions? If not?
Sorry.
Not at all. Correct.
Do they have any impact on forms and open up?
Yes. Okay, so we live in a really weird, so the question is, has internet separation, the Singapore government has a policy of internet separation, meaning that government laptops and work cannot access the internet for security reasons. And the question is, does this impact our work? And yes, it has. Basically, we live in this weird paradigm right now where you have 2 fundamentally conflicting policies. One, which is that you need to be internet separated to protect yourself from all the evils of the hackers of the internet. On the other hand, because you want to be a digital, not smart nation, you have to go cloud first. And you can't do both simultaneously, not in any meaningful way. So a lot of what we do is finding clever ways around that problem. So for example, with forms, the whole solution to sending emails through is because of internet separation. So if it wasn't an internet separation problem, we would set up a server, we would encrypt it with all this good stuff, but that takes very long because you need to get exceptions to the internet separation rule, you need to tunnel, you need to enforce, you need to firewall, do all these funny things. And so our easy way around that was, well, when someone submits a form, we just send an email, because you can still email government workers, and so this was our loophole through the issue to let our project go live. More generally, I think one of the things you realize is that, like, if you have a weird environment, the life forms that evolve will be very weird too, and the life forms that thrive need to be strange. And so if you look at stuff that, if you look at a lot of government solutions right now, it's a lot about like creative bureaucratic problem solving rather than just sort of like throwing your arms out and being, well, internet separated, we can't do anything. You say, all right, well, I really wish this problem wasn't here, this barrier wasn't here, but you need to treat the bureaucratic problem itself as a thing you work around. Yeah. Cool. All right. Anyone else? If not?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.